He said it plainly. Western science has no framework for this. And he's right, because what Korotkov documented isn't a fringe theory. It's a measurement, a photograph of something leaving the body at the moment of death. You already sense that consciousness isn't simply switched off. That sense isn't confusion, it's recognition. Science now has the image to match what you've always felt. And then, the image disappeared. Here is the pattern. Every civilization that ever grappled seriously with death arrived at the same conclusion through completely different languages. The Egyptians called it the Ba, the Hindus called it prana, the Greeks encoded it into the word pneuma. The Gnostics built entire mystery traditions around its preservation. These weren't primitive attempts at comfort, they were documentation, careful generational documentation of something they could observe, not with instruments, but with trained perception refined over centuries. Now we have the instruments. Gas discharge visualization technology, GDV, developed by Dr. Konstantin Korotkov at St. Petersburg's National Research University, makes the human biofield visible in real time, not metaphorically visible. Measurably, quantifiably, reproducibly visible. 200 clinical studies across universities on multiple continents, peer-reviewed, published, and yet somehow absent from every mainstream conversation about what happens when we die. Once you see that pattern, ancient tradition encoding precisely what modern instrumentation now confirms, you cannot unsee it. The suppression isn't accidental. That mechanism, the specific way this research was sidelined and why, is coming later in this video. And when it lands, it will reframe not just how you think about death, but how you understand the entire architecture of what you've been taught about reality. Stay with me through this, all the way through. Because what begins as a story about one Russian scientist and one piece of technology opens into something that touches your own existence directly. This isn't information you receive and file away. This is information that changes the operating system. The ancient traditions knew that. Korotkov's data confirms it. And by the time this is finished, you will have both the evidence and the framework to hold it. Let's name the layer we're actually standing on here. Because before you can understand what Korotkov discovered at the moment of death, you need to understand the instrument he was using and why that instrument represents something genuinely unprecedented in the history of human inquiry. Gas discharge visualization is not Kirlian photography. That distinction matters. Semyon Kirlian, a Soviet inventor working in the 1930s and 40s, discovered that when a living organism is placed on a photographic plate and exposed to a high-frequency electrical field, it produces a corona of light, a visible emanation. The images were stunning, a leaf glowing at its edges, a human fingertip radiating structured patterns of light. And for decades, those images lived in the uncomfortable borderland between science and mysticism, fascinating, reproducible, but not yet measurable in any clinically meaningful way. Korotkov changed that. Working from Kirlian's foundational discovery, he engineered a system that moved the phenomenon from art into data. GDV works by applying a brief, controlled, high-voltage electrical pulse, we're talking milliseconds, to the fingertips. The body responds by emitting a photonic glow, a corona discharge that is then captured by a CCD camera and processed through proprietary software into a detailed map of the body's energetic state. What you're seeing in that image isn't heat, it isn't sweat. It isn't an artifact of the electricity itself. It is the body's own electromagnetic field responding to stimulation, and that field, it turns out, is structured, coherent, and sensitive to changes in physiological and psychological state with a precision that standard medical diagnostics cannot match. More than 200 published clinical trials. Universities in Russia, Germany, India, the United States. Researchers measuring the biofield changes associated with stress, disease, meditation, acupuncture, and, critically, the dying process. This is not fringe data produced in a single laboratory by a single enthusiast. This is a body of evidence assembled across cultures, across institutions, across decades. So here is the decode move. The aura isn't mysticism, it never was. What every tradition from the Egyptian priests to the Byzantine icon painters to the Hindu chakra cartographers was encoding in gold leaf, in sacred geometry, in meditative maps of the subtle body, was biofield data. They were documenting something real, something they could perceive, train others to perceive, and transmit across generations in symbolic language because they had no oscilloscopes, no CCD cameras, no voltage pulse protocols. They used the instruments available to them, refined human perception and the language of symbol. Korotkov gave us the instrument that speaks the other language, the language of measurement. And what it says matches what the ancients encoded with a precision that should stop you completely. The Vedic system maps 7 primary energy centers along the spine. GDV, biofield analysis, produces a body map with corresponding zones of measurable energetic variation. Correspondence, not metaphor. Correspondence. Consider what that means at a civilizational scale. For centuries, actually, for millennia, the dominant institutions of Western culture have drawn a hard line between the material and the immaterial. Body on one side, soul on the other, science on one side, spirit on the other. That line was not discovered, it was decided, and it was enforced through the systematic dismissal of any evidence that complicated it. Kirlian photography was called a curiosity. Biofield research was called pseudoscience. The researchers who pursued it were called credulous. And then Korotkov built a device that produces 200 peer-reviewed studies and a body of clinical data that any honest scientist would be required to take seriously. The line didn't hold. It never held. The ancient traditions knew it couldn't hold because they were working with direct observation of a phenomenon that does not care whether your epistemology has room for it. Actually, let me say that again, because this is the piece most people miss. The biofield doesn't require your belief, it requires your measurement. And once you measure it, once you have the images, the data, the longitudinal studies tracking what happens to that field as the body approaches death, you are no longer in the territory of faith. You are in the territory of evidence. Which brings us to the threshold. Because what Korotkov and his team documented when they turned that instrument toward dying subjects, when they ran the GDV measurements in the hours and minutes surrounding clinical death, produced data that the mainstream scientific establishment has never adequately explained, addressed, or engaged with. They simply looked away. But what does the data actually show? What happens to that measurable, quantifiable, reproducibly documented biofield at the moment the body stops? That's the layer underneath this one. And it is the layer that changes everything. There is a layer underneath the data that most researchers never name out loud, and it is this. Consciousness does not leave the body all at once. Think about what that actually means. Every tradition that ever mapped the dying process, every culture across every continent that spent time watching the threshold, arrived at the same structural observation. The energy departs in sequence. It withdraws in stages. It does not simply switch off. Here is how the sequence works. The energy centers at the navel and the crown of the head begin to dim first. They lose coherence. The biofield contracts, pulling inward like a tide retreating from the shore. And the heart is last. The heart holds on.
Before we continue, some of what I've learned simply never makes it onto YouTube. That's why we have Insights Academy, a free newsletter where I go deeper into hidden knowledge, ancient wisdom, metaphysics, and the nature of consciousness. The knowledge we don't share in these videos. And when you sign up, you'll receive the Kabbalion as a welcome gift. You'll find it through the link in the description below or by scanning the QR code on your screen. I'll give you a moment to do that.
In the language of the ancient texts, the heart is the final residence of the self before departure. It is the last room the light leaves. The Brihadaranyaka Upanishad mapped this exact exit path thousands of years before Kirlian photography, before gas discharge visualization, before any Western laboratory had a word for biofield. This is one of the oldest philosophical texts in human history, composed somewhere around the 8th century before the Common Era, and it describes the withdrawal of prana, the life force, moving through specific channels, following a specific order, departing through a specific point at the crown of the skull. The Sanskrit term is Brahmarandra, the opening of Brahma, the exit gate. Now ask yourself the obvious question. How did they know that? How did people living thousands of years ago, without oscilloscopes or photon multiplier tubes, without any of the instrumentation Korotkov would later use, arrive at a description that matches the sequential field collapse his cameras documented in the modern era? The answer is observation. Sustained, disciplined, intergenerational observation. These traditions were not guessing. they were recording. The mystery schools of Egypt, the Vedic seers of the Indus Valley, the Tibetan monks who spent lifetimes studying the dying process and encoded their findings in the Bardo Thodol, they were empiricists working without our tools, but with something we have largely lost: the willingness to look directly at death and take notes. And what they all noted, independently, was the sequence. There is something else in the data that almost never gets discussed. Korotkov's GDV measurements showed something disturbing and precise about deaths that were sudden or violent. In natural deaths, deaths that followed illness, that allowed the body time to complete its process, the biofield withdrawal was relatively clean, gradual, coherent. But in cases of sudden traumatic death, the aura signature did not follow the sequence. It fragmented, and those fragmented field signatures lingered. Not for hours, for days. Let that settle for a moment. The energetic residue of a violent death persists in measurable form for days after the body has ceased all biological function. Korotkov documented this. It is in the data, and when you cross-reference it with what the Tibetan tradition calls a disturbed bardo, the state of a consciousness that did not complete its transition, the correlation is not metaphorical, it is structural. This is the decode move that changes the entire frame. Death is not a moment. It never was a moment. The idea that death is a single event, a switch, a line, a before and after, that is a cultural assumption, not a scientific finding. What the data shows, what the traditions mapped, what every serious investigator who looked without flinching found, is that death is a process, a gradual frequency departure, a staged withdrawal of the organizing field that gives the body its coherence. You are not watching a light go out, you are watching a signal change frequency. And once you understand that death is a process, with structure, with sequence, with measurable stages, a different question becomes unavoidable. If this is documentable, if it is reproducible, if ancient traditions and modern instruments are converging on the same map, why don't you know about this already? What was actually buried was not just the data, it was the implication of the data, and that implication is what the next layer is about. Here is the layer that the previous one was always pointing toward. The research did not simply fail to gain traction. It was actively, systematically, and in some cases, institutionally redirected away from public consciousness. Start with the scientific dismissal. When Korotkov's gas discharge visualization work began appearing in peer-reviewed contexts, the mainstream response was not engagement. It was not replication attempts or counter-studies. The response was a label: moisture-based corona discharge. That was the explanation offered. The light patterns captured around living and dying tissue were attributed to variations in surface moisture, not to a biofield, not to any organized energetic structure, moisture. Ask yourself whether that explanation actually satisfies what the data showed. Sequential withdrawal, post-mortem persistence, personality-correlated patterns that lasted for days. Does moisture explain that? Does moisture have a personality signature? Does moisture withdraw from the navel before it withdraws from the heart? The label was not a scientific conclusion. It was a termination of inquiry, and there is a difference. This is where the CIA enters the picture in a way that most people are not aware of. The Gateway Process documents, declassified in 2003 after decades of classification, confirm that American intelligence agencies were actively researching consciousness as a field phenomenon throughout the 1970s and 80s. The Gateway Report, written by Army Lieutenant Colonel Wayne McDonnell in 1983, explicitly engages with the mechanics of consciousness as a frequency-based system, references the holographic nature of the universe, and treats the survival of consciousness beyond physical death as a serious operational question. This was not fringe speculation. This was a classified military document engaging with the exact same framework Korotkov was building in Russia, which means the research was not invisible to institutions. It was being tracked, actively, on both sides of the Cold War divide. And then, in 2024 and 2025, Korotkov published new data in collaboration with researcher Valverde. The findings were precise and replicable. Personality patterns, the specific frequency signatures associated with individual identity, persisted in measurable form after clinical death, not randomly, not as noise, as organized, coherent, identity-specific patterns. The self, as a frequency structure, continued to register after the body stopped. This is the decode move. The dismissal of this research was never disproof. Disproof requires engagement. It requires replication attempts, counter-evidence, methodological critique that actually addresses the methodology. None of that happened at scale. What happened instead was the oldest suppression mechanism in institutional history. You do not argue with what you do not want people to think about. You simply decline to amplify it. You label it and move on. You defund the adjacent programs. You make the career cost of pursuing the question high enough that most researchers self-select away from it. Dismissal was the mechanism, not disproof. And here is the threshold this layer opens, stated plainly. Once you see who benefits from you believing that death is the end, once you trace the economic, institutional, and psychological infrastructure that depends on your relationship with mortality being rooted in fear, something shifts. Because an organism that believes it ends at death makes very different choices than one that understands itself as a frequency in transition. It is more controllable, more urgently consumable, more willing to trade long-term sovereignty for short-term comfort. The moment you stop fearing death as annihilation, you stop being manageable in the same way. And that, not the moisture, is why the research vanished. Once you see that, you are already free. So here is where this lands for you, directly and without softening. You are not a body that happens to have consciousness. You are a frequency that is currently expressing through a body. That is not poetry. That is the convergent finding of ancient map traditions and modern instrumented research alike. When death reframes as transition rather than termination, something changes in how you live right now, today. Not in theory. You stop being a victim of your own finitude. You start making choices from a different ground. If you have had an experience at the threshold, a near death, a moment of inexplicable knowing, a presence at someone's passing that felt like more than grief, I want to hear it. Your experience belongs in this conversation. Leave it in the comments. Your insights consistently add layers to this work that I could not reach alone. The next movement in this series goes deeper into the architecture itself. Sacred geometry. The structural blueprint encoded in every major tradition's vision of what comes after. The map is more precise than you have been told. You are not separate from the signal. You never were. You are an expression of it. See you at dawn. What did this unlock for you? Leave it below. Every comment adds a layer to what this becomes. And if you're ready for the next layer, sacred geometry is already waiting.